as they are found in a historical book of law, for example, a classical thinker. And the rest of us are moderate Muslims, maybe 30%, maybe 40%, maybe it's best to be 40% in this society. But the fact that there is the unspoken assumption that a superficial application of Sharia or Islamic law, based on the understanding of a historical thinker or a historical scholar or jurist, represents being a true Muslim, represents a greater commitment to Islam, that is something that does permit and allow an individual who might be less rooted in an intellectual tradition or in a spiritual tradition to gravitate towards extremism. Many of these people do not become extremists in their house of worship, but they don't get inoculated against extremism sufficiently in their houses of worship. That interpretation of Islam and that realism within Islamic institutions is important. So there's 2 points. Number one, we need to re-emphasize, in my mind, the classical Islamic tradition, its nuance and its sophistication. I do believe that when Muslims apologize for or speak of the need to reform Islam, they can often be counterproductive. Not to say that reform is not needed. Reform is a constant process. But within the Islamic tradition, there is a potential and a history of engaging in that reform on its own terms. And that needs to be acknowledged and respected. Largely speaking, the classical Islamic tradition and institutions were very much opposed to the progenitors of this extremist ideology that we find spreading itself in the world today. And I can say this without any doubt, that had it not been for Western support, had it not been for colonial support, this extremist ideology would have died out in the Muslim world on its own terms. Not because of a military defeat, not because of a political defeat, but because of an intellectual defeat. If you wish to debate that, then look at the history, the intellectual history of the late Ottoman period. Look at the prominent Islamic scholars in Zaytuna, in Northern Africa, in Mauritania, in Yemen, in Syria, in Hejaz, in the Ottoman lands, in India, from the Sunni schools of thought, from the Shi'i schools of thought. And that will become clear that this prominence is an artificial prominence. And it's not because Islamic tradition was intellectually unable to defeat extremism. But regardless of the factors, that is a battle that Muslims need to be aware of and need to come to terms with. And not just say, well, this is all the cause of external forces, and non-Muslims also need to be able to play a role in that. The first part is that intellectual reclaiming of the Islamic heritage and redefining it as needed. But the second part is that we need to have avenues for the redress of political and other grievances that many Muslims have, that are the motivation for a turn towards extremism. This is where Muslims and non-Muslims can come together and can help each other out in the best possible way. There are too many Muslims who see that refugees have existed as refugees within the Muslim world, and many of them are not Muslims, but they're within the Muslim world. They may be Christian, and they may be Muslim, and they may belong to other groups. But they have been refugees generation after generation. We have stateless people. We have forms of indentured servitude or slavery that exist within the Muslim world. And for many people, they don't find any recourse within their Islamic institutions or a welcoming environment outside to be able to seek a deeper understanding and a redress of those grievances. When you don't provide the avenues for that redress, then it becomes very difficult to control the explosion when it happens. And sometimes that is what we have seen in the recent past. Final point that I want to make is that within the Islamic tradition, the classical Islamic tradition, there are many means of addressing extremism, but there are also certain things that we need to be able to address in a more open and a frank environment. For example, the scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who is seen as the founder in many ways, perhaps somewhat rightly and perhaps somewhat wrongly, of extremist thought. Now, if you ask any Shi'i Muslim, what do you think of Ibn Taymiyyah? Then you don't need to have a long-winded speech like I just gave. They'll be able to answer you in 2 words. But there might be words that I can't repeat. I can't. And that's not fair. Because Ibn Taymiyyah was an intellectual. And he was a thinker. And some of his thought is something, this is perhaps one that I should say on camera either, but some of his thought is something that needs to be engaged, even if it needs to be engaged in order to be refuted. That dismissal is something which is not productive. At the same time, though, we have an idolization, a certain honor that is granted to Ibn Taymiyyah, which is unfortunate within the Muslim world. I mean, this is an individual who would write polemical tracts and call his polemical opponents dogs, or call his polemical opponents the children of the impure. And so, without speaking of demonization, this is something that is part of the literature and part of the heritage of one church and perhaps certain traditions within the Muslim world that have acquired prominence. Neither the demonization nor the whitewashing of these realities is going to be a service to the Muslim world. And so I would fault in that both those who are opposed to Ibn Taymiyyah's project for not engaging it and refuting it in a sufficiently intellectual way, and also those who may idealize him. They often self-censor what parts of Ibn Taymiyyah they will quote. Were more people to know of the positive and the negative aspects of his thought, and especially his verbiage, then it might be much easier to move past some of the harm that has been caused by the application or by the interpretation or misinterpretation of that thought. I'm ending somewhat abruptly because my remarks were a little bit longer than I had planned, but I think with the conversation, I hope we'll be able to continue, and I hope that it has been of some benefit to all of you present. Thank you for your attention.
It's always refreshing to hear someone who actually knows what he's speaking about such a confusing subject sometimes. And I want to reiterate how Syed, this conversation is not limited to this space. We speak every Friday at 4 at the union. For more information, you can contact us. But at this point, I wanted to open up a forum for questions